This episode is brought to you by Wear Buff, your go-to for Buffalo-inspired apparel. Get your hands on stylish t-shirts, hoodies, and more at wearbuff.com. That's wearbuf.com. And make sure you use the promo code TWB at checkout for 10% off your first order. Stay Buffalo proud with Wear Buff. We are taking a look at training camp battles on the defensive side of the ball this week on the Wandering Buffalo podcast.
You're now listening to the Wandering Buffalo podcast with your host, Justin Goddard.
Bills Mafia, welcome in and thank you for joining me on this week's episode of the Wandering Buffalo podcast. My name is Justin and I will be your host today. And this show is on the Buffalo Fanbase Podcast Network. Tons of great shows coming out pretty much every day of the week. So make sure you're checking out some of the other shows. Even if this show is not your flavor, there's tons of stuff out there. If you like the Bills, there's something that you like, so check it out. Show is also brought to you by Wear Buff. I've been talking about Wear Buff for probably about a month or so now. Some pretty awesome t-shirt designs, hoodies, merchandise, new designs coming out all the time. Just picked this one up. I ordered it a bit late for Pride Month, but hey, it's here now. It's pretty sweet stuff there, so check it out. Links to that right on our website. Today we're going to be talking about training camp battles on the defensive side of the ball. Covered some of the battles on the offensive side of the ball last week. So if you haven't heard that one, go ahead, check that one out. Today we're going to move on to the defense, and the defense is where I'm kind of more excited for what the training camp battles look like. I think the offensive side of the ball, while there is a ton of change, there's a lot of things that stayed consistent too. And, most importantly on offense is your quarterback, and we got 17 back there. So we've seen it with other great quarterbacks. You got to kind of rotate the weapons in and out, and things are going to change along the way, but your hope is that, your superstar franchise quarterback is going to help elevate some of the guys. Some of these dudes, I always think of Curtis Samuel for this, playing with just subpar quarterbacks his whole career and still putting up numbers. Well, what does he look like with a great quarterback, right? So the defensive side of the ball, I think, is a bit more interesting. We saw a ton of players leave when you think of Hoyer, Hyde, Trey White, just these long-term cornerstones on the defensive side of the ball. So for me, not only are there a couple starting positions that are going to be interesting battles, but I mean also when you start looking at the depth, and in particular a couple positions here where we saw the depth really get tested last year. Beans kind of made some moves this offseason that's like, hey, let's not go down that road again. Still some areas of concern for me on the defense. There's still time to tinker with the roster. We got training camp right around the corner. But I think we're pretty much where we're going to be with this group, maybe an addition or two. But I want to start out at the defensive end, which I think is not the most interesting conversation as far as starters go. Obviously, you have Groot, you have Epinesa, who I believe will be the starting defensive end opposite Groot. Vaughn, who I think maybe goes into a little bit more of a rotation row, try to maximize his pass rush reps. You signed Dwayne Smoot. I think he's an interesting player. kind of rounding out depth. And then you kind of look at this remaining group, and I guess I'll put Smoot in there too, of who's going to be, kind of the last guy to make this team. You have the free agent acquired this offseason in Casey Toohill. You have your draft pick in Javon Solomon, long time kind of practice squad rotation guy, Kingsley Jonathan, and then Cameron Klein, who was signed last year, um, also kind of a practice squad guy. And I think it's it's a pretty easy, you hope Javon Solomon is the one that makes this team. Um, Casey Toohill, I got kind of excited for as a free agent addition to, round out depth. I think Javon Solomon is somebody that had their eyes on, and Toohill was kind of signed to be that, in case we can't get a guy in the draft. Um, do I can't sit here and say Solomon will be ready to be, making an impact week one. Um, a late round pick. Effective defensive ends are, usually pretty hard to get, deeper in the draft. But all the messaging that's been coming out of one Bills Drive about Javon Solomon has been super encouraging to me. Um, we've seen him, staying late after practice, working with Sean McDermott, and I don't know. I think there's just a lot of room to be excited there, and it's not the most daunting depth chart ahead of him that, maybe this year and going forward, there's room for him to make an impact. Um, so I think it's an interesting group. I will say that this is one of the positions where I'm kind of left wanting more. Um, we had Leonard Floyd last year lead the team in sacks. We haven't really done anything to replace that. You hope Groot and Epinesa can stay healthy. I think they both had tremendous starts to the season and then were kind of hampered by injuries. But both of them have dealt with a good amount of injuries um, throughout their careers so far. You got the 35-year-old Von Miller. You're hoping 2 years removed from his injury, he can be somewhat of the player that he was uh, when we signed him. We'll see what happens there. Uh, I think overall, this was a group that could have used, a bigger addition, but, here we are. Moving on to the defensive tackle room. I mean, your 1-2 punch, amazing 1-2 punch when they were playing together healthy last year in Ed Oliver and Daquan Jones. And then it kind of becomes a numbers game of how many are we going to keep. Austin Johnson, I think that's an awesome free agent signing. I was also really excited for Deshaun Williams. Um, I think he's kind of been playing out of position throughout his career and still making an impact. Um, as as kind of your rotation defensive tackles, these guys are going to get a lot of snaps. I automatically, you know, kind of put them both ahead of like the Jordan Phillips category. I don't think we were getting very much out of him. Um, so right there, that top four, I was pretty excited for. And then I think this is a pretty similar situation to the Javon Solomon conversation where it starts to be a numbers game and these guys are added before the draft. Um, Brandon Beane always does a very good job of this, of just kind of filling holes and letting the draft come to him and, not having to reach for a particular position. Um, we have seen him do that a couple times. But then you pulled Dwayne Carter in the draft and now it's how many guys are we going to keep there? Eli Anku also in the mix, long-term practice squad guy. He gets called up all the time. He's been signed to other teams for the active roster, made his way back to us. Um, but I think that's a very interesting group. I think it's somewhere where we have struggled with depth immensely over the past few years, and it's always challenging because we rotate players so much, but then the drop off when you rotate can't be that significant. Um, I love the idea of the rotation and keeping guys fresh and, having your Ed Olivers, ready to make an impact play at the end of the game because he's still got some juice. Um, but I think there's been a lot of times where we've kind of struggled when, your rotation guys are coming in. So excited to see how that group shakes out. Um, like I said, this is a position where it's kind of your top two are really solid, and then the intriguing storylines for me is like how that the depth behind them plays out. Um, Super excited for Dwayne Carter, and hope he can end up being a piece. Oh, I didn't even throw in here Gable Stevenson. Um, Obviously, an Olympic wrestler and just, super athletic guy who's never really played football. A low risk, high reward type deal. Maybe he comes in if you're asking him to, do pass rush reps, it's not like, he needs to know every X and O of football that's ever been created. If it's kind of get in there, pin your ears back, and go after the quarterback, who knows? Maybe he's something year one. I'm not going to get too excited for it. Um, but an interesting name added into the mix as well. Um, so we'll see how that all works out. Like I said, Dwayne Carter, somebody I'm really excited for because I have wanted, a decent investment at the defensive tackle position going back years. And this was like back to when Starla Tulele was in the mix and getting a little bit older. And we didn't really have a long-term answer behind him again. And then it was kind of the same thing with Daquan Jones. This past offseason, would he even be coming back? And I think he's a tremendous player, but he's also getting up there in years a little bit. So to at least have somebody with, some decent draft pedigree that can be in the building, that can start learning behind these guys, um, hopefully he can become, one of the long-term answers there. Um, Moving into linebackers, this is about the same story as the defensive tackles for me. You're starting two in Matt Milano and Terrell Bernard. Um, I think this is like a super slept on group. I've been seeing like some PFF rankings and stuff coming out, rating the top linebacker units in the league. And like the Bills aren't even listed on the top 10. And it's like everybody forgot who Milano is. And kind of understandably so. He was hurt most of last season. Um, but Bernard burst onto the scene last year. Um, really shut me up for all the concerns I had about middle linebacker. And, his production alone stepping in as the starting middle linebacker was impressive enough, but like realizing that he did it without Milano as his running mate, you know, getting into linebackers, 2, 3, 4, 5, Daquan Jones being out most of the year. Um, Super excited to see the two of them playing together. Hopefully we can get a full, healthy season from both of them. Um, but if we don't, Brandon Bean kind of looked at what happened last year. We're calling AJ Klein from his family vacation to come start playoff games. Um, Bean did his work trying to kind of round out this depth, so hopefully we don't end up in that position again. Um, Adding Nicholas Moreau, Deion Jones, Balen Spector, who's been kind of continuously in the mix, when he can stay healthy, which hasn't really been often. Um, we have third round pick in Dorian Williams, who was, kind of a head scratcher linebacker pick we made a couple of years ago. Um, it was very similar to the storyline with Bernard of like, why did we take this guy? Um, obviously Bernard ends up slotting in as a starter pretty quickly. Dorian Williams doesn't really have that clear path right now. Um, but as far as like, a player in the system that's been in the building, developing, he has the physical traits. Um, what kind of noise can he make in this depth chart? Then we have a draft pick this year, Edifon Ulofoshio. Um, think he could at least contribute immediately on special teams. Joe Andreessen added from UB. Um, just a lot of depth here that gets me more excited than AJ Klein. And this is not meant to be AJ Klein slander. I know there is it's he's been around for so long. It's a few years back where you know he was the brunt of everybody's joke. AJ Klein can't play, blah blah blah, and then he came in moments and like absolutely balled out. Um, that being said, he was getting up there. He was, basically retired and starting playoff games last year. Um, so I think there's kind of a good mix of, youth and, veterans here, some some young guys, developing draft picks. And also looking at this group is looking at, the changes to the kickoff rule, thinking about losing some key pieces on special teams like Tyler Medikevich. So there's going to be a bunch of these guys that make the roster. Honestly, the Bills usually keep six, and I'm looking at, a total of nine guys on the roster right now. And I'm having a hard time, you know, seeing a path of who makes it and who doesn't. So I think this is kind of a group where you're throwing a bunch of bodies at the position that you think can play. And then we're going to kind of see how training camp and preseason shakes out. Maybe a couple of these guys end up on the practice squad. But I think you at least have a group of guys here where if the depth is tested, you have your choices between, do you slot in a veteran like Deion Jones that you trust to be in the right spot all the time? Or do you want to, have a little bit more variance and throw Dorian Williams in, who, we've seen, kind of make splash plays, but also make full speed mistakes that, lead to bigger plays. Um, so I'm intrigued by the options here. All that to say, as far as defensively, I hope that we got Milano and Bernard all season, and we only see these other guys on special teams and blowout wins. Um, that's a great idea on paper, but it's the NFL. The cornerback room, this is one where I'm intrigued, and I also feel like we could have added more here. Um, Very similar situation with the linebackers to me of your top two, top three, because we're always in nickel in Rasul Douglas, Benford, and Taron Johnson. Uh, Phenomenal. I love that. Love to see them all stay healthy. Um, Benford in particular has missed a ton of time with injury, and you're one away injury away from Kyrie Elam stepping in. And I will say that don't think we have the full story on Elam yet. He's still a super young player, and it's probably going to give people flashbacks to Tremaine Edmonds. Um, but I'm probably a bigger believer in Elam than a lot of people. Um, Not to say that he hasn't had his issues when he's come in, but he's also made some really big plays for the Bills. Um, Thinking about, like the interception against the Dolphins to effectively end the game. There's a handful of those in there. Um, I think this is a big year for him, but I think he's also going to get his reps and kind of have his chance to, kind of stabilize his NFL career. And, maybe he's an answer going forward. Um, but when we look at him as, arguably the number three cornerback right now, um, I just think about how much time we've seen, you know, Dane Jackson having to start games because of an injury, or, we have to move the rotation around a little bit. Um, this is a group that's been kind of ravaged by injuries over the past few seasons. And, Trey White's not here anymore, but he's missed a ton of time. And that forced you to start guys like Dane Jackson. Um, so I don't think Elam sitting in that, third cornerback spot means that we're not going to see him at all. I think we're going to see good chance that we see a lot of him. So it kind of feels like it's becoming a make or break year for him. Um, Behind him, Jamarcus Ingram, Daquan Hardy, Kyron Brown, Kenny Lovely, and Corey Couch. And Ingram is a guy that I have liked for a while, and he's one of those fun to root for guys. It's kind of been making his way up through the practice squad, very Cam Lewis like path. Um, and he's looked pretty good when we've seen him out there, um, albeit in a very limited sample size. Um, I think he's your kind of direct competition with Elam for that primary backup spot. And then Daquan Hardy, a draft pick this year with, the return abilities. Maybe he factors in into the return game. We'll see what happens there. I think that could be, kind of a path to him possibly making the roster. Um, like I said, that this group very top heavy for me. I would have liked to see kind of like a little veteran insurance in case Elam's not where you want him to be. But this is one of the situations where I kind of lean a little bit more towards, for lack of a different way of saying it, just trusting the process. Um, the coaches, the training staff, all that, they're in the building with Elam every day. Um, we heard Bobby Babich say, it's a new year. This is a clean slate for Elam and kind of resetting the deck. Hopefully he's able to, kind of put it all together. And, maybe we're sitting here this time next year and, talking about the Bills decided not to bring back Rasul Douglas, but no worries. Elam looked great last year. He's going to slide up right next to Benford, and we just carry on with two young guys. So Elam is easily the biggest name I'm watching there and kind of trying to see how the offseason goes for him. And then the safety group, again, a position group where it was just kind of we dealt with injuries. Uh, we had some struggles there, and then you know I'll say we've lost Micah Hyde and Jordan Poyer for now. There's that the never say never thing going on with Micah Hyde, where between him and Bean just kind of talking about the door being open, and if he doesn't retire, he would only want to play for the Bills. Um, I'll always be excited if Micah Hyde's in the mix. He's dealt with some kind of scary injuries, and he's on the tail end of his career anyways. For his well-being, uh, I would probably say go ahead and hang it up. But I'm not gonna lie, if the Bills announced tomorrow that they were bringing Micah Hyde back for one more year, I'd be hyped for it. So we'll see what happens there. But in the interim, Taylor Rapp, Mike Edwards, Cam Lewis, second round pick Cole Bishop, Damar Hamlin, Kendall Williamson, and D Delaney. And I think this is very similar to the linebacker group in, here's a bunch of guys that we think could conceivably start. Let's let them all go at it and iron sharpen iron, and whoever's the best comes out and you're going to be starting. Um, Rap obviously gets an extension this year, which I was really excited about the signing of Rap last year, and then I think it was kind of a mixed bag last year. Um, but obviously, things weren't really the ideal situation last year. I mean, you got Hoyer playing, like a box linebacker, and Raps put in there, and the whole situation just wasn't super ideal. Um, what I like about this re-signing of him is he was only here on a 1 year deal and, in the building with everybody every day. And, despite having that mixed bag season last year, the staff could have chose to move on from him and be like, hey, we tried it out. It didn't go well. We're going to look at different options. And they chose to bring him back. So that vote of confidence gives me a little bit of a pump up in how I feel about Rap and, possibly being one of the starting safeties. Um, Mike Edwards and G Delaney, I think these are both intriguing guys that have, spent time being depth players, you know, like higher snap depth players. These aren't, just guys that were sitting on a bench. Um, but I'm interested to see what either of them can do, given the opportunity. Cam Lewis, I talked about a little bit briefly, and his come up, putting in the work, coming from the practice squad to, kind of lock down a roster spot, and now in conversation to be, you know, possibly one of your primary starters. Um, Mike Edwards dealing with an injury right now. Does that keep him out of training camp preseason? I don't think so. Um, but if it's something where they kind of wanted Edwards to take his time with it, maybe you see Cam Lewis get some extra work in there. Um, Cole Bishop, super excited for this draft pick. Um, I think this one might go the way of making a lot of Bills Mafia mad. When we don't play our rookies right away. I mean, this group right here has like all the familiar symptoms of Cole Bishop's not going to be our week one starter. There's a lot of like veteran depth added here, um, that I think he can kind of take his time and come along, and they can pop him in when they feel comfortable. But I think he's going to be one of your two starters sooner rather than later. Um, and then Damar Hamlin, obviously. Um, Look, he's a guy that before, his horrible incident was, a pretty high draft pick, and he was getting starting reps, and he was playing as a full-time starter, and he was making some plays, he was making some full speed mistakes. Um, and then obviously his learning curve there and his development kind of came to a screeching halt. And then last year spent most of the season inactive. So last year was kind of a wash for me. Um, with Mike Edwards out with an injury right now, Hamlin's kind of been uh, he's been a hot name in making plays, and you just hear his name a lot, and maybe that's a little bit of off-season hype, not too many storylines going around, so you latch on to some things. Um, but I mean, he was essentially projected to be a replacement at safety when, it came time for Poyer and Hyde to say adios. Um, we'll see what happens there. He's somebody that I'll be keeping an eye on. Um, like I said, throughout the training camp and the preseason. But there you have it. Defensive side of the ball, kind of battles all over the place on the defensive side of the ball. And like I said, it to me is a bit more interesting than offense because you have a lot of change on offense, but you also have a lot of continuity. And I guess the same could be said for the defensive side of the ball. But even some of the continuity is with major changes behind it, or you're looking at like Epinesa going from, just this strictly rotation player to, now possibly kind of the full-time starter. What does he look like with more work? Um, so I think there's a lot more. I think there's a lot more opportunity to kind of find younger gems in this group. It kind of seems that anywhere they added some veteran depth, it's to compete with like a young draft pick or, a young player that's been working their way up from the practice squad. So I think there's a lot of interesting storylines here and reasons to be excited for the future. So that's going to do it for this week's episode. If you made it this far, I do ask that you like, share, subscribe. Make sure you're following us on YouTube. All those things help us out immensely. Check out the website, wanderingbuff.com. Like I said, we have the links right to the Wear Buff clothing line. Do all the things. All the things help me out greatly. Keep this show coming out every week. We will see you next week for another episode. And as always, go Bills.